Hello. Can you hear it? Check, 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 check. Okay. I can hear it if I. Okay.
Good evening. Thank you all for coming, a good crowd. So tonight we have a very special gift as we enter into Holy Week, and we already have started focusing on the death of our Lord Jesus. There's a lot that goes into that. We know that we can think about our Lord being the Son of God and the just great sacrifice of that, the fact that he even became a man and then chose to live the life of a man and then even potentially die as a man. But we also kind of should think about the matter of how he died, the way that he died. That this is the way that he saw as fitting for him to die. And now we can kind of think about that today in the modern world in a really much more in-depth way than maybe ever before, because we can think about it even medically and scientifically. And so tonight, that's what we're going to do. And so I'm really grateful to introduce to you Dr. Aimee Goodier, who is going to tell us all about the death of Jesus, both spiritually and also medically. She's an anatomic and clinical pathologist working here in Baton Rouge at Ochsner as the director of the medical laboratory there at Ochsner Hospital in Baton Rouge. She's been in Baton Rouge for 10 years now, completed her pathology residency at University of Mississippi Medical Center, and has a husband and 3 children here in Baton Rouge. I know that she's given this talk in a few other places. She comes highly recommended, especially by Father David Dawson, who himself, before becoming a priest, was a medical professional. And so I'm really glad that he is getting her name around so that she can share this great information with all of us. So, Doctor.
Good afternoon, everyone. First, I'm going to just make sure that everybody can hear me. Everybody's good? Okay, and everybody can see the presentation. If not, you might want to scoot a little bit in so that you can see the slides. And I'm probably going to trip at some point, so I apologize in advance. So thank you all for coming, and thank you for having me. Before we begin, I noticed that there's some kids. I just wanted to give a little warning that some of the images might be a little graphic. They're not too bad, but I like to give out that warning. I tend to have a low threshold or a high threshold for blood. So just to make sure everybody's comfortable with it, I will not be upset if you walk out. I also wanted to add that some of the content may differ a bit from what you've been taught growing up. We all have heard these stories of how Jesus suffered and some of the theories that go along with it, and there have been varying ideas through the years. I'm going to present what I have researched and some of the more recent discoveries or theories about it. But of course, none of this can be proven. If there's something that you disagree with or you're like, that's not what I heard as a kid, I'm not here to offend. I just want to open up more dialogue about Jesus and about the Passion. So a little bit about myself. Like y'all heard, I'm in healthcare. I'm a pathologist. I've been in healthcare for over 25 years. I actually started my journey as a nurse. I went to LSU Nursing School in New Orleans and worked at Charity Hospital for a little while. And that initiated my kind of interest in forensic medicine, which led me to medical school and then ultimately to pathology. In pathology residency, you get forensic training. I didn't do a fellowship in forensics, but I did get some training in it. And I'm hoping that that information and that experience will help you guys and add a little bit more to your ideas and thoughts on the Passion. So without further ado, make sure this works. So the bulk of this lecture comes from these 5 books. The first one was written in the 1950s. Make sure this works. Okay, the 1950s, and this was by a surgeon by the name of Dr. Pierre Barbet. He actually initiated the medical investigation into Jesus' Passion with respect to the Shroud of Turin. He was the first one to kind of be credited for taking a look at modern medicine and a modern medical approach to the Passion. So he wrote A Doctor at Calvary. And then the second book is by Dr. Frederick Zagieb. Dr. Zagieb is a forensic pathologist. He came out with a book in the 1980s titled The Cross and the Shroud, that again, he looked at the Passion with respect to the Shroud of Turin. And then he also published this book. This is The Crucifixion of Jesus, a Forensic Inquiry, and it came out in 2005. Both of these books were kind of a rebuttal. He had read and studied what Dr. Barbet had come up with, and some of his theories differed from Barbet. So we're going to look at the two of them side by side in part of this lecture. Other books that I read in preparation were The Execution of Jesus Christ. The Execution of Jesus the Christ, which was written by a neurosurgeon by the name of Dr. Mark Kabbalah. And then there's The Crucifixion of Jesus that was written by Dr. Joseph Bergeron, who's a physical medicine and rehabilitation doctor. And both of these kind of these two right here, give a good synopsis of what these guys discovered. They weren't as technical, and they also gave a little bit more of the historical aspect. So I think these two books were a very good read. And then this last one is by Martin Hengel. It's The Crucifixion, and it's more of a legal approach and a historical approach to what crucifixion looked like back then, and I found it to be helpful. But if y'all are going to pick one up just to read it, either one of these two books, I think, were probably the most inclusive. So where do we get evidence from in a case that happened 2,000 plus years ago? We can't really investigate the scene because the scene's not there anymore. But what we do have, we have the gospel accounts, and the gospel accounts are actually primary sources of material, so those are very helpful. We also have some writings from other historians, both Christian and non-Christian, from this time period that mention Jesus, they mention the crucifixion, and they even mention stories of the resurrection. We have Old Testament prophecies that need to be taken into consideration, as they need to be fulfilled. If this is truly the Messiah, it should go hand in hand with the Old Testament. For those of you who believe in its authenticity or have ever heard or studied the Shroud of Turin, I'll disclose that our authors all took the Shroud of Turin as being authentic. So a lot of this lecture will take into account the Shroud of Turin. If it is truly the authentic Shroud of Jesus, then there's a lot of evidence in that shroud that we can use to kind of piece together what happened during the Passion. And there's also church mystics, which I think it's a fascinating group of people. There are a few of them who have actually had visions about Christ's Passion. So we're going to touch on a few of them too and see if all of these things can overlap and kind of give us a picture of what happened during the Passion. So this is kind of just a little outline of what we're going to touch on, and it's a little bit much, so we're going to go ahead and just get started. We're going to start with a historical perspective, because any good investigation has to take into account the scene. So that's where we're going to begin. Our story takes place in the city of Bethlehem in roughly 30 AD. It opens with the Feast of Unleavened Bread, or as we know it, the Passover. So the Passover is a 7-day-long celebration for the Jewish people, remembering God's deliverance of them from the Egyptians. During this time, all of the Israelites in the area were required to return to Jerusalem, to the temple, in order to offer a sacrifice. So no matter how far and wide they're spread around that region, they all have to come back to Jerusalem, to the temple, to make a sacrifice. And that means that millions of people were flooding the city during this week. It was a very, very important week for Jews. So who are our major players in this? First, we have the Romans. Jerusalem was under Roman occupation during this time, so Rome kind of controlled the area. They would get taxes and they would enforce a few of their laws, but they kind of let the Jews self-govern themselves. They were there kind of to police the area and pretty much to collect taxes. Pontius Pilate was the prefect of Rome, Judea from the years from around 26 to 36 AD. He didn't actually live in Judea, but he would travel there with reinforcements during these large Jewish celebrations in order to ensure that there was no uprising. When you have that many of the same group of people together, they tend to talk and they tend to find strength in numbers. So Rome did not want them to have any kind of an uprising during this time when there were so many of them together. So Pontius Pilate would come down, especially during the Feast of the Passover. And we also have the Jews. Herod Antipas was sort of the Jewish governor at the time, but most of the high priests and the scribes and the Pharisees were really the main community leaders during this period. These leaders kind of benefited in some way from the Roman occupation, and they were historically wealthy people. Some of them, as we know, were corrupt. The gospel account documents escalating tension between Jewish leaders and Jesus during the weeks leading up to the Passover. And once Jesus enters the city for the feast, the Pharisees and Sadducees, that tension just escalates. And by this point, they've had enough and they're ready to get rid of him. So before we begin, there's a couple of things that I just want you to keep in mind as we go through some of this medical evidence. First, Jesus was an active and healthy carpenter. He was used to walking long distance. Maybe he was a little dehydrated and underfed because he lived in poverty, but not to an unhealthy extent. Analyzers of the Shroud of Turin estimate the man of the shroud to be around 6 feet. The average height of a Jewish male at that time was around 5'4", so Jesus would have been considered tall. And his estimated weight was around 170 pounds. Another thing I'd like to point out is a passage from John 19. Verse 36 states, "For these things took place, that the scripture might be fulfilled. Not a bone of him shall be broken." Here, he's referring to a bunch of Old Testament passages. For example, in Exodus chapter 12, when speaking of how to prepare the Passover lamb, verse 46 states, "In one house shall it be eaten. You shall not carry forth any of the flesh outside of the house. You shall not break a bone of it." And then Numbers chapter 9, verse 12 reiterates this. "They shall leave none of it until the morning, nor break a bone of it. According to all the statutes of the Passover, they shall keep it." And then David in Psalms states, he keeps all his bones, not one of them is broken. So keep that in mind as we progress through this lecture. We start, of course, in the Garden of Gethsemane. Here is a look at the garden from one of Father David's recent trips to the Holy Land. This is actually believed to be a tree, very, very similar to the tree where Jesus was praying. After the Last Supper, Jesus and his disciples headed up to the Mount of Olives to a garden called Gethsemane, which means the place of the olive press. It's been said that Jesus' suffering and agony were so heavy that he literally fell to his face and was pressed down to the earth by the weight of all of our sins and betrayal. A lot of people have kind of wondered exactly what was going through Jesus' mind during this time. I think we kind of underestimate the agony that he went through. And I think of all the people, we, as our generation and our time right now, can most probably relate to this part of the agony. Because of all of the pain and the depression and the hurt that we feel. Imagine Jesus in the garden. He's probably pretty depressed. He feels rejected. He feels, I'm sure he's human. He probably feels like he's not going to be able to do this and he's not good enough. He probably feels like his friends have left him. He's all alone. All of those things that make us feel just empty inside sometimes. Multiply that by all of humanity, and that's what he was going through while he was in the garden. Just complete and total emotional and mental breakdown, I imagine. And he withdrew from them about a stone's throw and knelt down and prayed, "Father, if thou art willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done." And there appeared to him an angel from heaven, strengthening him. And being in an agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. Interestingly, Luke is the only gospel writer who includes this detail, and that's likely because Luke was a physician. So our question is, did he mean this literally, or could have this been a figurative comment? Most of the signs point to this being a literal comment, because the phrase sweating like blood wasn't common back then. We don't find it in any historical writings. In fact, medically, the excretion of blood or blood pigment into sweat or sweating blood is known as hematidrosis or hematohydrosis. It's exceedingly rare. There aren't many recent cases. But of those reported, most of the more recent ones are young females between the ages of 9 and 13. So this still does happen, it just doesn't happen very often. Historically, though, Historical reportings date back as far as the time of Aristotle. Most accounts are associated with severe anxiety reactions triggered by fear, and these are some examples. We have prisoners before execution, women during a sexual assault, sailors during times of a severe storm at sea, and there's actually a documented case of a young girl who would have these episodes during air raids during the war. It's usually a single episode or a single event, but it can be recurrent, and it often subsides with treatment for anxiety. So here's an image from a recent article that was written in 2018. This is a 9-year-old girl who presented with leaking of blood from her scalp, eyes, and her mouth. In these situations, especially with kids, it's very important to rule out a large number of things like abuse, trauma, bleeding disorders, vasculitis, etc., before coming to a diagnosis of hematohydrosis. This young lady was found to be in excellent health, and all of her workup came back negative. Further investigation found that she was subjected to repeated non-physical bullying at school that led to these recurrent bleeding episodes. She didn't experience these episodes during holidays or over the summer break when she was away from school. And you can see just how much, it's kind of a watery red liquid, it's mixed with sweat, but you can see how much fluid that she's losing. It's soaking her shirt, it's coming out of her eyes. It's pretty impressive. How does this happen? What's the pathophysiology? Stress can cause the vessels that are around your sweat glands to constrict and also to dilate. When they constrict and then dilate again and then constrict and dilate again, they can ultimately rupture. Once they rupture, that blood leaks out of those capillaries into the sweat gland next to it. It mixes with the sweat in the sweat gland and then is expressed onto the skin surface. If you look here, you can see here's your blood vessel that's coming up. It's getting tangled in with the sweat gland, and then the sweat gland goes up to the skin. So very easily, if those little capillaries burst and leak into the sweat glands, you can see how this can happen. The effects of hematohydrosis and the severe anxiety that is associated with it are general weakness, depression, mild to moderate dehydration, and hypovolemia, which is low blood volume or low fluid volume. And this is due to that excessive sweat and blood that's lost. This would have definitely weakened Jesus on that night prior to his crucifixion. It's also thought that because you have these little bursted capillaries in your skin, all of that would make your skin a lot more tender and fragile. So then we have the Jewish judgment. After praying, temple guards seized Jesus. At this time, it's roughly 1 o'clock in the morning. Jewish guards find Jesus in the garden, they arrest him, and they bring him to the house of the head of the Sanhedrin. And they led Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests and elders and the scribes were assembled. Now, the Jewish leaders spent the night trying to get some sort of evidence against Jesus, but they could find none, despite many false witnesses that they brought before the Sanhedrin. Ultimately, they asked him point blank, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" And Jesus responded to them, "I am. And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." Mark continues saying, "And the high priest tore his mantle and said, 'Why do we still need witnesses? You have heard his blasphemy. What is your decision?' And then condemned him as deserving of death. And some began to spit at him and to cover his face and to strike him, saying to him, 'Prophesy.' And the guards received him with blows. So then Caiaphas hands him over to the guards, who were instructed to keep him until morning." The gospel writers don't go into much detail here, but we can at least see from the writing that Jesus was struck by both the scribes and the priest, and he was received by blows by the guards. The Greek word here used for struck translates more literally into to strike with the fist. This sort of beating may result in bruising, not only of the skin, but also in some underlying ribs and potentially even his kidneys or other organs. So here's a fun picture of some lovely boxers after a fight. And remember that these guys are in a controlled environment with referees, and they still walk away looking pretty roughed up. Now imagine Jesus being subjected to this sort of beating from temple guards who were probably not very happy about being woken up at 1 o'clock in the morning. Also, Jesus didn't have a mouth guard, and losing a tooth isn't considered breaking a bone, and I can't imagine him escaping this whole ordeal with a full set of teeth. But just to kind of drive home the point, if they really were punching him and beating him, it's not going to be something that's insignificant in the course of the passion. It's going to be a little bit more dramatic. And unfortunately, this is only the beginning for Jesus. Though it's not explicitly stated in the Gospels, there are traditional stories that point to Jesus actually being flogged by the temple guards. Luke chapter 22, verse 63 states, "Now the men who were holding Jesus mocked him and beat him." But interestingly, Luke uses the Greek verb durantes for beat him. He uses the word durantes, which carries the primary meaning to flay the skin. Jewish floggings were very common and traditionally administered using a whip made of calf skin to the bare upper body of the offender. 1/3 of the lashes would be on the front of the body and 2/3 would be on the back of the body. Both Peter and Paul recount that they received such floggings on more than one occasion, so it wasn't something that was uncommon. Now, the Jewish law limited this sort of punishment to no more than 40 lashes. So much was the case that they usually only gave 39, because if they gave 41 on accident and the prisoner died, that was going to be on the person distributing the lashes, and they were going to be held responsible for that, and I think the penalty was death. So they gave 39 lashes to most of these individuals. This is the kind of pattern injury that you would get from being whipped in this fashion. You get this kind of central, what we call central pallor, this kind of blanched out area in the middle surrounded by 2 lines of abrasion or redness. And if the cuts were deep enough or the lashes deep enough, it would cause a splitting in the skin, which would lead to lacerations and bleeding. This is believed to be part of the pillar that Jesus was tied to for the Jewish flogging. It's housed today in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. So this is just a little more evidence that maybe he was flogged by the Jewish guards. So they hand him over to the guards. He gets beaten and flogged. Then where do they put him? Where does he end up that night? Where is he being held? This is actually a picture looking down into the cell that they think that he was housed in the night before his crucifixion. It's just a big hole in the floor, and you can look down into this cell. They think it was previously used as a cistern. So this is you in the cell looking up outside of it. So this is probably the view that he would have had. You can see some people walking around in the bottom down here. I'm sure it wasn't lit, but this is another picture from the Holy Land. And actually, the guide is holding his arms up to demonstrate how prisoners may have been tied up. There was actually some evidence within the cell that supported that there were restraints in the cell to tether their arms. He also said that they found some salt in a deep bowl-like object that was carved into the rock. They believed that the temple guards would take the face of the beaten person and shove it into salt water as part of their punishment. Father David, on his trip to the Holy Land, said that they made the remark that if the water was from the Dead Sea, just a drop of it would have been absolute torture. For comparison, the salinity or the saltiness of the United States, the Great Salt Lake, varies between 5 to 25%, whereas the Dead Sea is around 33%. But even if they just used regular salt water, salt in a wound is never fun. In my readings, I also came across the theory that the cistern may have actually still been filled with water. And what they would do is they would fill it with water so that those prisoners couldn't sit down or lay down or rest or sleep. They'd have to stand up all night. Remember, it was a cold night. On this night, Peter had to go warm himself by the fire. So it's very, very possible that Jesus spent his last night in a hole in the ground, immersed in water, cold, alone, and just, I mean, if it was any one of us, we would be terrified. So the Roman judgment. When the Sanhedrin presented Jesus to Pilate, they didn't charge him with blasphemy because they knew that Pilate wouldn't have cared less about that. Instead, they came up with a story about how Jesus intended to undermine Caesar and his authority. Despite their false accusations, Pilate still found no crime in Jesus. So he tried to get them to drop the charges, but the Sanhedrin persisted. After he had said this, he went out to the Jews again and told them, "I find no crime in him, but you have a custom that I should release one man for you at the time of the Passover. Will you have me release for you the King of the Jews?" They cried out again, "Not this man, but Barabbas." Now Barabbas was a robber. Now Pilate has a dilemma. The Jews want Jesus dead, but he has no real reason to kill him. If he kills an innocent, it's going to look bad on him to the Romans. But if he lets Jesus go, he's going to have a Jewish uprising on his hands. And just a side theology note here, Barabbas in Aramaic means the son of the Father. Theologians have remarked that we are all Barabbas. We're the sons of the Father that should have been crucified, but Jesus took our place instead. So John continues, "Then Pilate took Jesus and scourged him. And the soldiers plaited a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and arrayed him in a purple robe. They came up to him saying, 'Hail, King of the Jews,' and struck him with their hands." Now it's believed that Pilate had him scourged, and scourged badly, in order to appease the Sanhedrin, hoping that they would change their minds once they saw how bad the scourging was. So just a quick summary to this point. Jesus endured intense agony accompanied by hematidrosis in the Garden of Gethsemane. Once he was apprehended, he traveled a mile or so on foot to Caiaphas' house, where he was beaten and possibly flogged. I'm sure he had some facial swelling and bruising, maybe even some internal organ damage at this point. The skin on his back was probably very raw, with at least a few lacerations from the 40 lashes. If his hands were tied, he likely had some sort of injury around his wrists and potential bleeding from there. If they were actually tied above his head, he would have experienced severe muscle cramping and spasms of his upper body during the night that he was held. Being held in water on a cold evening would have caused hypothermia and muscle spasms all over as well. He was dehydrated at this point. He was weak, he was sore, and he was exhausted. Now, Roman flagellation was often used as a prelude to crucifixion, so it was used before you got crucified, and in this context, it was referred to as scourging. It could also be used for execution, but in most cases, it was used to bring the victim as close to death as possible without killing him. Remember that Pilate was not usually in Judea. He was only there to assure peace was held during the feast of the Passover. And when he came to town, he usually brought with him a legion or 6,000 soldiers from Caesarea to help keep the peace. These were hard, gritty soldiers. Their job was to kill people. Their job was death, and they were very skilled at their job. Being that they were from out of town, they likely had little or no local knowledge of Jewish politics, so they probably didn't even know who Jesus was. They thought he was just another Jewish rebel or zealot. Again, the theory is that Pilate wanted him scourged badly so that the Jews would no longer feel the need to crucify him. He needed it to look dramatic. And unlike Jewish flogging, the Romans had no limit on the number of lashes. So Jesus was brought from Pilate in the praetorium. He was stripped of his clothes and he was tied to a pillar. So there are very varying theories on how he was tied. Historically, some of the prisoners were tied with their arms above their head so that they couldn't dodge a strike. If your arms are above your head, you're close enough to the pillar to where you can't really, you can't hide. Others were tied with their hands low down, like this guy. These had a little more mobility. They could kind of dodge. but their back was fully exposed. So it would mean that most of the lashes would end on their back. Blessed Anne Catherine Emmerich, a church mystic who was known to have seen images of Christ's passion, said this of the scourging. Jesus put his arms around the pillar, and when his hands were thus raised, the archers fastened them to the iron ring, which was at the top of the pillar. They then dragged his arms to such a height that his feet, which were tightly bound to the base of the pillar, scarcely touched the ground. Thus was the Holy of Holies violently stretched, without a particle of clothing, on the pillar used for the punishment of criminals. And then did two furious ruffians, who were thirsty for blood, begin in a most barbarous manner to scourge his sacred body from head to foot. This is believed to be the remains of the scourging pillar that the Romans used, and it's located in the Basilica di Santa Prasad in Rome. The instrument that's used in scourging is called a flagrum, and the man wielding the flagrum is referred to as a lictor. It's usually comprised of a long piece of leather cut into strips and attached at one end by a handle. There were often small bones, metal balls, or dice attached to each free end. If you look at the Shroud of Turin, it suggests that the flagrum used on Jesus was indeed multi-tailed and had dumbbell pieces of metal attached to the end. You can see that here. This is what they think it looked like. Jesus was likely scourged by two large Roman lictors. Areas targeted include the back, the shoulders, and the upper legs. Scourging for the Romans was both a sport and an art. And again, they were highly trained soldiers. The goal, again, was to inflict maximum amount of pain without causing death. So the lictors would circle their victim, changing the angle and position of each strike. They would alternate so that there was little or no time for the victim to brace for the next blow. As the flagrum whipped down, the lictor would try to wedge the bone or metal tips underneath the skin so that when he yanked it back, it would rip the skin open. There, of course, are also references to additional beatings and ridicules in between strikes. I'm pretty sure that there was a lot of talking and beating and slapping and belittling. Historically, there was always someone overseeing each scourging to make sure that the victim could endure what was going on. Sometimes they would have to revive them by splashing water on their face, but they would go and check and make sure that they weren't too close to death. They knew when to stop. This next slide gives a great illustration of how Jesus may have been tied. So this shows how he may have been tied, with his arms up and his feet dangling at the bottom. And this is looking down the pillar. You can see the lictor wielding the flagrum onto Jesus' back, which would result in these kind of downward injury patterns. And again, there were usually two. Jesus probably twisted and writhed on the pillar. So of course, if they're aiming for the back and the legs and the chest, some of the strikes are going to stray, and he's going to get some on his arms, he's going to get some on his legs, on his back. They're going to land everywhere. He even has some, if you look at the Shroud of Turin, on his abdomen. Ordinarily, the abdomen was avoided because there's no skeletal protection on the abdomen, and they were always scared that they were going to accidentally eviscerate their victim. And they didn't want to do that because the point was not to kill them. According to the Blessed Anne Catherine Emmerich again, and also other mystics, Jesus did not cry out or resist at all during his scourging. Instead, he prayed for his abusers the entire time. The 4th century church historian Eusebius describes scourging, saying, "Bystanders were struck with amazement when they saw them lacerated with scourges, even to the innermost veins and arteries, so that the hidden inward parts of the body, both their bowels and members, were exposed to view." Likewise, the 1st century Roman philosopher Seneca noted that the crucifixion victims would have had many excuses for dying before even mounting the cross. These are some various artist rendering of what Jesus may have looked like after the scourging. These images don't include bruising, welts, or swelling that would have accompanied the trauma, but they give you a good idea of the extent and the pattern of injury. I think this one's a little much. I think that no one could have endured that without bleeding to death. But you can see how it's going to be very traumatic and very dramatic. I think the best indication of pattern and distribution comes from the Shroud of Turin. So here's the Shroud of Turin. If you're not familiar with the Shroud of Turin, here is the man of the shroud. This is his head. His arms come down and cross. His hands cross. And then here are his legs down here. They've highlighted all of the scourge marks in red so that you could see him. The shroud passed over the front of his body and then back down the back. So on this side, you see the front panel with all the scourge marks on the front panel. And here you see the back of his head, and this is his back going down to his legs. So you can see all the stray marks that end up everywhere in his body. And then recently, someone created a 3D image of the shroud and the man in the shroud, and that's what you see over here. You can see all the scourge marks on his body. And of course, these aren't no longer bleeding, and we can't see how much blood is being poured out from these wounds, so they look a little less dramatic than they probably looked in real life. In addition to the immense pain, the muscle spasms, and the bleeding that would occur during a scourging, several other horrible physiologic changes were occurring as a result of this abuse. As muscle cells are damaged, they release their contents into the bloodstream. This raises potassium and myoglobin levels. Potassium and myoglobin are usually held in the cell, so when it pops open, because it's damaged, the contents leak out into the bloodstream. So increased blood myoglobin can cause severe kidney damage, which is a bad thing because the kidney is actually one of the areas that regulates blood potassium. So your kidney's trying to excrete potassium, but the increased myoglobin causes the kidney damage. Now you have increased potassium because of the cell death, but then you also have increased potassium because you can't excrete it through your kidneys because your kidneys are damaged. Increased potassium in the bloodstream is an incredibly bad thing. It can be very dangerous to cardiac muscles, causing arrhythmias, rhythm irregularities, and even cardiac arrest. As for nerve damage, the majority of Christ's injuries thus far have caused what we refer to as nociceptive pain. This is the pain that you're very used to feeling, the pain that when you cut yourself, when you have swelling, it's kind of that danger sign that says, hey, something's wrong. It's the normal pain. But it would also caused something that we call neuropathic pain. Neuropathic pain is a pain that is caused by injury to or malfunction of a nerve. This pain is much different and it's much more intense. It's that burning, searing, or electric lightning bolt pain that people experience. Some of you have probably dealt with that kind of pain, sciatica, trigeminal neuralgia, and it's not fun. It's very likely that Christ's nerves were actually damaged and that he experienced this neuropathic pain. Finally, of course, there's blood vessel damage. With trauma, bleeding increases, which in turn triggers the body's coagulation or clotting response. Unfortunately, with severe trauma, you also lose a great deal of your clotting factors as you bleed. Clotting factors are in your blood, they help you clot, but if you're losing it because you're bleeding so much, that can be a problem. So this, combined with his hypothermia from blood loss and from other factors, will confuse the body's clotting response and start what's known as a coagulopathy. The result is inappropriate clotting and lysing or breaking down of clots. And once this starts, the victim is no longer capable of adequately clotting and stopping his bleeding. So by now, Jesus is in a state of both early traumatic shock and early hypovolemic shock. The chest region was likely also subjected to a number of blows, which could have resulted in several different types of injuries. Bruised or broken ribs. Now remember, not a bone should be broken, so we're going to assume that he didn't break a rib, but a bruised rib would have impaired his ability to adequately inhale or exhale. If y'all have ever had a bruised rib when you're coughing Every time you breathe in or out, you can feel it, it hurts. And that's a pain that would have followed him for the remainder of the passion. A bruised or even focally lacerated lung would have impaired his oxygen exchange, making him short of breath and even lightheaded. Also, there are air spaces within the lung that could have ruptured or burst, causing what's termed a pneumothorax or a collapsed lung. What happens here is that your little alveoli, the little sacs of air, if they burst open, you can have air that actually leaks. I keep doing that, I'm so sorry. You can have air that leaks out from the lung into the space between the lung and the chest wall. And as more and more air leaks out into this space, the pressure here increases and pushes against the lung and causes what we know of as a collapsed lung. The lung shrinks up because there's so much air pressure there. Also, it's important to mention that trauma to a lung can cause the release of fluid or blood into this same pleural space. So over here, they're showing a fluid accumulation around the lung. Most believe that the scourging initiated a slow buildup of this fluid in this space. So there's a slow and steady buildup. So if it began at the scourging, it's only going to get a larger and larger accumulation of fluid as we progress through the passion. And we'll see why this is important a bit later. So now the crowning with thorns. Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the praetorium, and they gathered the whole battalion before him. And they stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him, and plaiting a crown of thorns, they put it on his head, and put a reed in his right hand. Kneeling before him, they mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they spat upon him, and took the reed and struck him on the head. And when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the robe and put his own clothes on him, and led him away to crucify him. Here's some pictures of an exhibit in the Holy Land that show what the crown of thorns was actually thought to look like. It was thought to look like more of a cap or a helmet instead of a wreath. The exact plant used is a subject of debate, but botanical experts favor the Ziziphus spina Christi, or what's known as the Syrian Christ thorn, a member of the buckhorn family that grows in abundance in Jerusalem. So here you can see it has these long spines, but it also has some curved ones. You can't really see them very well in this one. But in this next one, you can see, I don't know how well that translates, but there's a circle there. You can see these little curved spines as well. So you have these long spines, and then you have these little curved spines. And they think that this is probably what was used to make, it would have been a dried out form of this plant, because it was probably lying around, and the soldiers just kind of grabbed it up and made it into this kind of helmet or cap. The curved spines would be very problematic, because once you get those kind of hooked into your skin, well, if they move at all, they're going to rip through that skin. If you try to pull it out or anything, you know they're kind of jammed in there. So what kind of damage could the crown of thorns cause, apart from just soft tissue damage? Well, first it can cause nerve damage. Over here, we can see this yellow, all these yellow lines are nerves. First, we're going to talk about the trigeminal and the greater occipital nerve, which are both sensory nerves. So here, the occipital nerve covers the back of the head, and the trigeminal nerve is around the front of the face, and it, again, is a sensory nerve. Here, again, we can see Christ experiencing that nociceptive pain as well as that neuropathic pain. There are many superficial branches of these nerves on the face and the scalp. You can see how much they branch, and this is probably not even enough detail. The rigidity and the sharpness of the crown make it almost impossible for these spines not to have either damaged or severed some of these larger nerves. This would again produce that neuropathic pain consisting of that lightning bolt feeling each time the nerve was stimulated. Some of you may be familiar with a condition called trigeminal neuralgia. Trigeminal neuralgia is described as causing a stabbing, explosive pain to the affected side of the face that lasts for a few seconds to minutes. Light touches, facial movements, Chewing, talking, or even drafts of air across the face can precipitate an attack. It's a very difficult thing to treat, and patients with severe forms have been known to be highly suicidal. Then there's the facial nerve. This is a motor nerve. It's also going to be in the front of the face. It's responsible for movement of the face. So it's possible that Christ could have impaired his facial nerve due to damage. He wouldn't be able to close an eye, or maybe he wouldn't be able to open an eye. Any kind of movement damage, you could cause damage that would impair the movement of his face. So any of you who have experienced Bell's palsy before, where you have that facial droop or you lose control of that side of your face, you might be familiar with this. It's not fun. It's somewhat miserable. And then, of course, there are blood vessels. Your scalp is actually one of your most vascularized areas of your body. Blood loss from the crown, especially in the setting of an already established coagulopathy and hypovolemia, would have been devastating in most individuals. We shouldn't underestimate the amount of blood loss that could have been incurred both from the scourging and also the crowning of thorns. After the crown of thorns was placed, the guards wrapped him in a robe and gave him a reed as a scepter. Jesus' back was raw and bloody, and I'm sure the robe not only hurt when it was wrapped around his torn skin, but if his blood became adherent to the robe, I bet it was excruciating when they ripped it off of him. Also, the reed that they gave him was likely of the genus Phragmites, a common aquatic reed that grew in abundance along the banks of the Jordan. This type of reed is comparable to bamboo. It's strong and was often used as a walking stick. The damage and pain that being struck on the head and the body with this reed would have caused should not be underestimated. It's most certainly at least pressed the spines of the crown deeper into his scalp. So here we have Jesus. One eye may have been swollen shut, the other may have lost its ability to close. He could have been without half of his teeth. He was bleeding profusely from his head and his body. John 19 states, Pilate went out again and said to them, Behold, I am bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no crime in him. So Jesus came out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. And Jesus said to them, Behold the man. When the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, Crucify him. Pilate goes on still, doing his best to get out of the situation. But the passage continues a little later on, with Pilate saying to them, Shall I crucify your king? The chief priest answers, We have no king but Caesar. So Pilate handed him over to be crucified. So they took Jesus, and he went out, bearing his own cross, to the place called the place of the skull, which is called in Hebrew Golgotha. To get an idea of what Christ's journey to Golgotha entailed, let's first take a look at the various types of crosses utilized for the crucifixion at this time in history. So first, there's the crux simplex, or the simple stake. So that's this one right over here. It's just a simple stake. The victim would hang with their hands tied above their heads and their feet tied below. This type of cross was used when large numbers of people were being crucified. Jewish historian Josephus wrote that the Emperor Titus allegedly just used these stakes in the ground when he was crucifying up to hundreds of Jews daily. Then we get to the group called the crux compaxa. And this group this is this group right here. It has an addition of another bar. First, we're going to talk about the crux emissa, and this is the one that was historically favored by most artists when they were depicting the crucifixion. And they think that they favored this one because it left enough room over the head of Jesus to hang the Titulus Crucis, or the placard that read, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. This cross has kind of fallen out of favor a bit in recent years for a number of reasons, but mostly because using one would have been inefficient and cumbersome for the Romans. The victim would have either had to have carried the whole cross to the site, or if he just carried the crossbar, or what's known as the patibulum, it would be difficult to fit that crossbar into a notch in the front, leaving this part in the top. So it took a little bit more carpentry and a little bit more resources. They didn't think that this sounded like it was true of the times. It just seemed tedious. So more recent investigations now favor this crux commissa that looks more like a tau cross. And what they thought was, especially given lumber shortages at the time, it was very likely that that long arm, or the stipes, was recycled through multiple crucifixions. So the Romans were known to have them lined up outside the city as a deterrent. So you just had these stakes in the ground. And then when it was time for crucifixion, the crucified was nailed to the patibulum and then lifted up to on a notch on the top of the stipes. So you could just lift it up and fit it right on the top, and it made it a lot more easy, and it just seems a lot more efficient. Dr. Zayeeb actually did some suspension experiments that we'll touch on shortly that proved that even this crux commissa would have had enough room at the top to hang that placard, or the Titulus Crucis. So more people are starting to kind of agree that this is probably what it looked like. And then our last cross is the St. Andrew's cross, though it's never really been proven that he actually died on a cross that looked like this. Josephus did comment, however, on the fact that during the siege of Jerusalem, Roman soldiers who were annoyed with the Jewish resistance nailed their victims to crosses using various positions just for sport. On a side note, we're not really sure what type of wood the cross was made from. The forerunners in that debate are the olive tree wood and an oak, but we have really nothing to go on to prove that either way. That brings up the question of, did Christ carry the entire cross? The whole cross likely weighed about 175 to 200 pounds. The patibulum, on the other hand, weighed roughly 60 pounds. So based on the previous slide, I don't believe that he carried the whole cross. I believe that he carried only the patibulum. He could have carried it either on one shoulder, or he could have had it strapped across his shoulders so that he could carry it on, kind of on his back. But I've heard recently that Padre Pio, who bore the stigmata, also experienced pain and a laceration in, I think it was his right shoulder. And this was believed to be due to an injury that our Lord suffered while carrying the cross. And Padre Pio actually said that this was the most uncomfortable part of bearing the stigmata. So Padre Pio believes that he carried the cross like this and it caused damage to that shoulder. Other things to mention here, some artists depict the cross with a seat or a footrest on it. Lots of historians deny that these ever really even existed in history. Not only was it a waste of wood and carpentry, but Romans weren't exactly in the business of doing anything that was going to make crucifixion more comfortable. So why would they put a footrest or a seat on it? It doesn't really make much sense. So now we journey down the Via Dolorosa, which translates into sorrowful way, or the way of suffering. It's the route that Jesus took to the cross. It's roughly half a mile hike. We think that this journey began around 8 or 9 a.m. on a hot, dry April day. The road was unpaved and bumpy. Jesus was very weak and probably had poor eyesight at this point. He had been standing all night, and all of his muscles in his back, arms, and legs were probably severely cramping. So he fell, most likely more than 3 times. If Jesus was carrying the patibulum on his shoulder, maybe he could have possibly braced his fall. If he was carrying it mounted on his back with his arms tied, he couldn't have braced, and he couldn't have stopped himself from falling at all. The beam on his shoulders would have increased the velocity of his fall either way, and his face, chest, or shoulders probably slammed into the rocky street with great force. Maybe his head hit the road, driving the crown even deeper and causing more bleeding. So the crucifixion. Here's a messianic prophecy from the book of Psalms. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It is melted within my breast. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue cleaved to my jaw. Thou dost lay me in the dust of death. we really do not get a great deal of detail about the crucifixion, specifically at the time of Christ's death in the Gospels. All they pretty much say was, and then they crucified him. But we do get a little bit more detail later from both John and Luke, which support that both of his hands and feet were pierced and not tied. Luke chapter 24, see my hands and my feet, that it is I myself. John chapter 20, then he said to Thomas, put your fingers here and see my hands, and put your hand and place it in my side. Do not be faithless, but believing. And a passage from Psalms is believed to be a messianic prophecy supporting this belief as well. Yea, dogs are around me, a company of evildoers encircle me. They have pierced my hands and feet. I can count all of my bones. They stare and gloat over me. They divide my garments among them, and for my raiment they cast lots. This is one of the earliest artistic renderings of Christ's crucifixion. It's thought to be from around 430. Some notes from it. The nails are actually in the hands or in the palms. He also has both feet nailed separately, so it's a use of 4 nails instead of the overlapping nail that we're used to with just the use of 3 nails. You can see the Roman soldier getting ready to drive a spear into his side, and then you can see Judas over here hanging from a tree. It's difficult in this section because there are not very many historical writings on crucifixion in general, so it's kind of difficult to come up with some evidence in this area. It was morbid and it was horrendous, and people didn't want to talk about it, much less write about it. Plus, the people who were affected by it were probably the lower class people who didn't know how to read or write, and they couldn't write anything down about it. And of course, the upperclassmen are not going to want to waste their time writing about something this horrendous. So we don't have a lot of details in historical writings. And there's also a lack of archaeological evidence. That might come as a bit of a surprise to you because we just talked about how thousands upon thousands of people were crucified during the first century. But unfortunately for us, when these individuals were removed from the cross, the nails were removed and actually recycled, and the bodies were often just either tossed in unmarked graves or left to wild animals. So any evidence of crucifixion was removed a long time ago. But we do have some evidence. In fact, this is one of the only archaeological samples that we believe was actually from a crucifixion. It's a calcaneus or heel bone that was discovered in the late 1960s near Jerusalem. And you can see, like we said, not all crucifixions were the same. They got crucified in different positions and on different types of crosses. So this guy, this is what it kind of looked like, where it went through his heel this way instead of what we believe Christ was in the front of his foot. So he was either nailed to the side of the stipes or like this in an odd position in the front. But you can see that the nail is still embedded in that bone. So we believe that it is from an actual crucifixion. There was also another calcaneus bone that was found in 2007, and it had a similar hole in it, but the nail had already been removed. So we can't really prove that that's from a crucifixion victim, but that's what archaeologists kind of believe. Which brings up the nails. Roman nails were made of iron with a gradually taping square shaft from the head to the point. We believe that they had a dome-shaped square head that was about 9 millimeters with a shaft that measured about 12 to 15 centimeters, or 5 to 6 inches in length. In the beginning of the 3rd century, St. Helen, Constantine's mother, allegedly found what is believed to be one of the nails that was used in Christ's crucifixion. This relic is on display in Rome and is consistent with the description as well as the nail that was found in the heel of that calcaneus bone in Jerusalem. So that it all kind of is consistent. This is a picture that shows it a little more to scale. You can see that it's a nice sized nail. It's about 5.5 inches. Here you can see that it does have a dome-shaped head. You can't really appreciate the squareness of the both the head and the shaft, but you can see how it tapers towards the end. So it was a pretty big nail. And so this, of course, brings up the question of where were the nails placed? And how could they have been placed or inserted in the hands without breaking or tearing through the soft tissue of the hand? So up until about the 1930s, it was generally accepted that these nails pierced Jesus' palms. In 1932, however, our surgeon, Dr. Pierre Barbet, declared that based on some of the findings on the Shroud of Turin, as well as some of the findings from his own experiment, he believed that the nails were actually placed in Christ's wrist. So Pierre Barbet is our surgeon friend. Now, our forensic pathologist, Dr. Frederick Zivgieb, believed that the nails did indeed penetrate Christ's palm. So we're going to take a quick look at both of their theories and kind of the evidence that surround each of them. But first, we're going to do a quick anatomy review of the hand. So you have right here, here's your hand, and you have your carpal muscles. These are your muscles. Your carpal bones are your wrist bones. Underneath, you have the radius and the ulna. And then you have the metacarpals, or your palm bones, and then the phalanges are your fingers that come off the end. So if you see here, here's your wrist. Here you can appreciate the wrist crease maybe. That's kind of your wrist crease that's there. So when we're talking about the wrist, we're not necessarily talking about where you wear your watch. We're talking more about that area around the wrist crease. So Dr. Barbet believed that the nail went straight through those carpal bones or that wrist bone, whereas Dr. Zivgieb, this is an area he called descot space, and then we're going to call this the Z area, where Dr. Zivgieb believes it went. That's right above your carpal bones, between the carpal and the metacarpal bones, and there's a space in there that he believes it could have passed through. So let's see what they think. Now, Barbet's reasoning is based on blood markings on the wrist of the man of the shroud. This is an image of the man of the shroud. If you can appreciate, it's two hands that are crossed over each other. You can see kind of the shadow of the hands. And there's a blood stain right here with this little bifurcation in it. It's like this little kind of branching into two different directions. He believed that because of where this was, if you look at this, you can see the fingers coming down here. It looks like that blood spot is right at that palm crease or that wrist crease. So he's basing his beliefs on where that stain is on the shroud. And also he believed that a nail in the palm could not adequately hold Christ's body weight. To prove this, he did an experiment where he took a severed arm, he nailed it to a wooden beam and attached an 88-pound weight to it. 88 pounds because that was roughly half the weight of an average man. And the nail, unsurprisingly, went straight through the soft tissue and the arm fell. Now, Dr. Barbet only did one experiment to prove this, which in the era of modern science, we know that doesn't necessarily prove anything. We also don't know the state of the arm that he used. Was it fresh? Was it from a cadaver? If it's fresh, it was likely amputated for a reason. So was there an accident that led to this arm being amputated? How old was the arm? Was it gangrenous? Was there significant atherosclerosis or vessel damage? All of these things would make the nail more likely to rip through that already damaged soft tissue. Also, he didn't account for the feet being nailed and potentially taking off some of the weight, claiming that the nailed feet would have only supported a negligible amount of Christ's weight. And he also didn't take into account the angle of the arms. His force was going straight down. So Zivgieb, on the other hand, was not convinced of Barbet's theory. Again, he instead believed that the nail passed through what he termed the Z area, right above those carpal bones. He claimed that the nail went in right above the wrist on the palmar side, but then was angled downward and exited at the spot at the stain on the shroud. So this is an experiment that he did on one of his autopsies. He put a spike through the palmar surface right above those carpal bones and angled it so that it exited right at that spot where the blood stain is on the Shroud of Turin. And he did this without breaking a bone. Zeeb also argued that the nail through the Z area could indeed support the weight of a man. He did this by providing a tension formula that took into account not only the angle of the arms, which was probably about 65 degrees, and the support from the nailed feet. And he determined that if you nailed a person in that area, it could support at least 200 pounds. So he believed that it wouldn't have ripped through the soft tissue, that it would have had plenty enough support for him to be able to hang there with the nails in that area. Some other things that he noted was that it was historically accepted that the nails passed through the palms until Barbet came out with his theory in 1932. He also stated that saints who receive the stigmata show wounds or have pain that are centered in that area of the palm. Biblical passages that we read earlier also talk about the hands, not the wrists. And finally, even if the nail goes in this area, it's still consistent with what some of the mystics have been shown. There's a mystic by the name of Saint Bridget who had a revelation from Mary who stated, "My son's hands were pierced at the spot where the bone is the most solid." Now, both of those locations, I think, would kind of fulfill that area. Your bone is most solid in this area. So even if you put it right above the carpal bones, it's going to feel like it's the most solid. So I think it fulfilled all of those things that he was looking for, and that's why he supports that theory. So then we move to the feet. And the biggest question with the feet is, were they nailed separately, or were they nailed one on top of the other? And remember that Jesus had to be nailed probably to the patibulum or the crossbeam and then hoisted up onto the stipes. There were usually 4 Roman soldiers that were assigned to each crucifixion. One of them was probably holding and supporting Christ's waist, while the other 2 secured the patibulum on the stipes. And the 4th was probably either helping where needed or directing them where to go. So once he was secured on the stipes, you probably still had somebody supporting his waist and his weight, while the other 3 figured out a way to nail his feet. Now, logistically, it would be easier for them to secure 1 foot at a time. These victims were likely thrashing about in pain, making it difficult to hold both legs down together. Also, if you put both legs together and both feet on top of each other, you're more likely to fracture a bone when you nail those feet to the wood. Early historical writings favor the feet being nailed side by side, and also St. Bridget and her revelation from the Blessed Mother indicates that 4 nails were actually used. Ultimately, we can't be certain. One of the most compelling arguments to the 3-nail theory is that the image of Christ on the cross that we have that's been around for so long usually shows that they're overlapping. Barbet is in favor of there being 3 nails, and he says that if you look at the Shroud of Turin, you can see that one of the knees is slightly bent. He attributes this slightly bent placement to the fact that the legs were overlapping, and that's why it was bent in. But Zeeb claims that he thinks that there were actually 4 nails used, and he attributes that change in position to rigor mortis after death. So he thinks that it doesn't have anything to do with the legs overcrossing. But again, there's really no way for us to know. So what are some physical effects of being nailed to a cross? Both hands and feet, again, you're going to have that nociceptive pain. You're going to have pain just because you have been cut and hurt, and I'm sure that would have been excruciating. But also there are very large nerves that run along your hands and your feet. You have the median nerve, most notable in your hand. If you would have severed that nerve, you're going to have that neuropathic pain again. This is that unrelenting, searing, burning pain that would have been aggravated with any kind of movement. So if you imagine as they're lifting him up onto that, lifting the patibulum up onto the stipes, all of that movement is going to be absolutely unbearable, especially when they drop him down and secure it. Also, with that nail penetrating next to his bone, the periosteum, or the lining on the bone, has a number of nerve endings in it. And scraping that periosteum would produce additional and extensive pain. Same thing for the feet. You have a planar nerve that could have been damaged, and you're going to have the same type of burning and horrible pain. Other things to think about. Being confined to the same position sounds miserable to just about anybody, but being nailed in the same position is a whole nother level of pain. Hanging on a cross with nerve damage throughout his body, he would have endured intense muscle cramping and spasms. Of course, the first thing you want to do when you start cramping up is to stretch your arms or your legs. But you can't do that if you're nailed down. There's no way that he could have adequately stretched. And any attempt to move and offset that cramping would have probably caused additional pain. His shoulders would likely have dislocated from their joints. The vertical position of his body would become problematic as he progressed further into hypovolemic shock. Shortly after being nailed to the cross, he would likely lose his ability to maintain adequate blood pressure, as his blood would be pooling via gravity into his lower extremities, decreasing blood supply to his brain and causing at least disorientation. Christ was believed to be nailed to the cross at approximately 9 o'clock and hung there until about 3 o'clock. Until noon, the sun was bearing down on Jesus, amplifying his agony. At noon, the sky became dark and gave him some reprieve. But up until that darkness, the sun would have only worsened his dehydration and hypovolemia. Some of the stories of crucifixion comment on the fact that the Romans would leave bodies of the crucified out to wild animals. They just leave them hanging on the cross and just let him go and let the animals get to him. Christ's crucifixion was relatively short compared to others, but it's not out of the realm of possibility that birds could have gotten to him, even at this point, and I'm sure the Roman guards would not have shooed those birds away. Insects as well. Jesus couldn't swat away any of the flies or any bugs that were kind of attracted to his state. And then finally, there's the crowd. It's mentioned in the Gospels that people walked by and mocked him. Who's to say that they didn't do worse? Did they throw things at him? I'm pretty sure they spat at him. They probably did anything that they could to humiliate him. And this whole time, Jewish leaders were baiting him. Here's this man who spent his whole life preaching to love your neighbor and to be kind to those who persecute you. They were trying to make him betray his message, but instead, he continued to pray for them. His first words on the cross were, "Forgive them, Father. They know not what they do." Christ died at around 3 p.m. on Friday evening. Let's analyze the 3 most common theories surrounding his cause of death. First, there's the asphyxia theory. This was favored by Dr. Pierre Barbet, and by many others. This was the one that I heard growing up. Barbet believed that some of the markings near the hand on the Shroud of Turin suggested a change in Christ's position on the cross due to difficulty breathing. Here you can see the hands of the man in the shroud. And like I said, there's this bifurcated pattern. It just branches in 2 different directions. Barbet believed that this occurred because the blood flow was altered with each movement of Christ's hand, and that the movement was a result of his inspiration and expiration. He also argued that Christ died so quickly because he couldn't breathe. So the asphyxia theory holds that the position of the cross, assuming that the arms were pulled down at a 65-degree angle and the back became arched, most of the experiments done on patients who were hanging from a cross or victims who were hanging from the cross, they tend to bow out a little bit. They arch their back. And so Barbet was saying that this is incompatible with breathing because when you're stretched out like this, you're expanding your chest and stretching those intercostal muscles and your diaphragm. So you're pretty much in an inhale position. And when you're stretched out like that, you can't close your chest to exhale. So what he said is that as Christ would have to exhale, he'd have to push up with his feet, bring himself up and close his chest. And he would breathe out and in and out and in. And he would have to physically force himself to push up on his feet to gain these breaths and to help him continue to breathe throughout the crucifixion. This movement would cause the pressure on his hand that would be responsible for that bifurcation pattern. Zaghib didn't really buy into this, though. Zagib's counter on the theory was really compelling. He did a number of experiments on healthy individuals around the same age and height as Christ at his time of death, suspending them from crosses and securing their feet. Not with nails, though. He would monitor their respiratory rate and their blood oxygenation and found that the subjects actually regulated their breathing within 10 or 15 minutes from being suspended on the cross. Any complaints of breathing difficulty went away after 15 minutes. And their oxygen saturation, surprisingly, throughout the course of their hanging on the cross, stayed above, it never went below 97%. None of them had to push up on their feet, and they actually said that they found the act of pushing up with their feet extremely difficult to even do. Zagib also notes that Jesus spoke 7 last words or phrases while he was on the cross. And if he were that short of breath or oxygen deprived, he wouldn't have been able to do any speaking. He would have been breathless and disoriented. And he also states that if this theory were true, Jesus would have died a lot more quickly. 6 hours is way too long to be able to maintain that breathing pattern, especially in that much pain. So next we move to the ruptured or broken heart theory. A lot of people like this theory because it sounds really romantic. The thought of Christ dying of a broken heart because of the sins of the world seems very fitting. And it also gives a reason behind the blood component in the blood and water flowing from the spear wound, which we'll get to in a little bit. So this theory insinuates that Jesus suffered a severe heart attack that caused either the heart wall to rupture or the aorta, which is the large vessel that leads off of the left ventricle, to rupture. And either the rupturing of the heart wall or the rupturing of the aorta would lead to bleeding into the pericardial sac, which is the sac that's around the heart, which would in turn, once that, and you can see it here, so there's a sac around the heart, and if you have a rupture that causes bleeding into this sac, again, the sac fills with blood and puts pressure on the heart, making it very difficult for the heart to beat. Now, there are some problems with this theory. First of all, Zagib is not a fan of this theory. He says that based on Christ's age and physical status prior to the crucifixion, he doesn't believe that this was possible. Christ was only 33 years old, and he was likely in great shape. He was active. It's not like he smoked cigarettes. He didn't eat processed foods. He didn't have access to large amounts of saturated fat. So a 33-year-old back then really has no cardiac risk factors at all. And the problem with the ruptured heart theory is that in order for you to have this ruptured heart, you have to have had a heart attack a couple of weeks before. What happens with these injuries is that the patient has a heart attack and damages the muscle and the heart wall. And that damage, it's a re-injury that causes it to actually rupture. So the initial damage doesn't rupture the heart. But if you have another heart attack a couple of weeks later, that's re-injury to that area is what's going to cause the rupture, and it's going to lead to what we see here. So in order for this to happen, Christ would have had to have had a heart attack 2 weeks prior, and he has really no risk factors for having a heart attack. And there's no mention of him being sick a couple of weeks before his crucifixion. So we're skeptical of this theory as well. And the last theory, which is actually my favorite and the one that I endorse, is the traumatic or hypovolemic shock theory. It's very difficult to deny that Christ was both in traumatic or injury shock and hypovolemic shock at the time of his death. Taking into consideration all of the events leading up to his death, I think that Christ died of cardiac arrest as complications of traumatic and hypovolemic shock. The average blood volume of a male is 5.5 liters, and hemorrhagic shock begins when you lose 20 to 30% of your blood volume. Loss of 40% of your blood volume is considered exsanguination and is incompatible with life. 40% of 5.5 is 2.2 liters. So Christ needed to lose 2.2 liters in order to die of exsanguination. Hypovolemic shock occurs when you don't have enough blood volume to get adequate amounts of oxygen to your organs. Lack of oxygen ultimately results in organ damage. Remember, Jesus lost a great deal of fluid through sweating, bleeding from the crown of thorns, bleeding from the scourging, and bleeding from the crucifixion. Now, traumatic shock, on the other hand, is shock that results from injury and pain. stimulates certain areas in the brain that result in a drop of blood pressure and a reduction in blood flow to the tissues. So right then, if you're already hypovolemic and then you go into traumatic shock where you have loss of your blood pressure and loss of blood flow to your organs, it only exaggerates the condition. I also think that this is the most biblical of all these theories. Leviticus 17 states, "For the life of all flesh is in the blood." And then Matthew chapter 26 states, "For this is the blood of the covenant, which will be poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." Then Hebrews 9, verse 12, "Christ entered not with the blood of goats or calves, but with his own blood to achieve eternal redemption." And then Hebrews chapter 9, verse 22, "Without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness for sins." The list of passages about the cleansing blood of Jesus goes on and on in the New Testament. I really literally think that he poured out his blood for all of us. And in case you've never seen this comparison, I think it's striking. 1 Peter says, "But with the precious blood of Christ, like that of a lamb without blemish or spot." This is how they would prepare the Passover lamb. You can see the faint cross in the background. Very, very much a foreshadowing of Christ's crucifixion. So now we get to the spear in his side. There are a slew of theories on this subject, but I'm going to discount some of them right off the bat. There are at least 3 theories that are based on the idea that Jesus was alive at the time of the spear going into his side. I'm not even going to discuss those since the gospel states that he was dead, and the Roman executioners knew he was dead because they were very good at their job. Remember, again, their job was death. They knew when people were dead. Some theories contribute the blood component being that bloody pericardial fluid from around the heart, like in the broken heart theory. They think that there was a blood component in that sac that accounts for the blood coming out in the spear. But we already discussed earlier that that's probably not what happened, considering that Jesus was in good enough health to not have had a heart attack. I don't believe that he had a re-injury rupture. So I'm going to discount that one as well. So there's only 2 that I'm really going to focus on. The first is that blood was from the piercing of the right atrium, so piercing of his heart, and the water was from a non-bloody fluid collection around the heart in that pericardial sac. And the other theory is that blood, again, was from piercing the right atrium, so the blood came from piercing the heart, but this time the water came from a non-bloody fluid collection around his lungs. I definitely agree that the blood probably came from piercing the atrium of his heart. Christ's blood would not have been flowing at this point because he was dead. But if a spear entered into his atrium and pulled out a clot from his heart, we see these stringy clots that are in the heart all the time at the time of autopsy. If he dislodged this clot, there would have been a change of the pressure gradient in the heart that would have caused the blood to look like it was flowing out through his side. So I agree with that. I believe that it really could have been as the blood component came from his heart. And as for the water, there's one of 2 areas it could have come from. It could have either come from fluid in the sac around the heart or fluid that collected around the lung. Well, when fluid collects around the heart, it's only about 25 to 50 milliliters of fluid. And if that's going to rush out at the same time as the blood from the heart is going to rush out, those 2 are going to mix pretty quickly because it's a very, very small amount of fluid and it's a lot of blood. So they're going to mix pretty quickly and you're not going to see that blood and water that's separated. I tend to favor that the water component likely came from a fluid collection around his lung. Remember, we talked earlier about how the scourging could have initiated a slow leak of fluid into that pleural cavity that would have just built up over time all the way to the time of his death. So I think there probably could have been a pretty significant amount of fluid accumulation around that lung. And when they stuck this spear into his side, it went into his atrium, pulled out a blood clot, and with it came blood from the heart, and then water that came from around his lung. This is actually the most widely accepted theory on this topic. And there's actually some beautiful symbolism here that no first century Jew would have missed. When sacrifices were being made at the temple, it was a really bloody ordeal, especially during the busy feasts like the Passover. The priest would spill the blood of the sacrificed animal onto the altar, which had a drain in it. That drain would take the blood down through the temple to a spout to discard it outside. This is what the Mishnah, a historical Jewish text, says about this event. At the southwest corner of the altar, there were two holes like two narrow nostrils by which the blood that was poured over the western base and the southern base used to run down and mingle with the water channel and flow into the brook Kidron. So when a first century Jew saw blood and water pouring from Christ's side, they would immediately think about the blood and water that was flowing from the outside of the temple. There's also a tie into Adam here. Adam had his side pierced in order to bring about a new creation, namely Eve. Like Adam, Christ's side was also pierced in order to bring about a new creation, the church. Let's look at what our brilliant early church father, St. Augustine, he's one of my favorites, said about this event. St. Augustine says, Adam foreshadowed Christ, and as Adam was a type of Christ, so too was the creation of Eve from the sleeping Adam, a prefiguration of the creation of the church from the side of the Lord as he slept. For as he suffered and died on the cross and was struck by a lance, the sacraments which form the church flowed from him. By Christ's sleeping, we also are to understand his passion. As Eve came from the side of the sleeping Adam, so the church was born from the side of the suffering Christ. Remember that a sacrament is a visible sign of the grace that God gives us. The sacraments that he's speaking of here, of course, are baptism for the water and the Eucharist for the blood. So as Eve is Adam's bride, the church is the bride of Christ. I thought that was a very beautiful thing. I feel like this talk wouldn't be complete without touching on the empty tomb, at least briefly, and the resurrection. If Jesus did indeed die on the cross, how was the tomb empty? So let's look at some of these theories that people have about the empty tomb. The first thing we have is the swoon theory. This is a theory that Jesus didn't really die on the cross, he just passed out. I argue that no one could have survived a spear into the heart. Even if Jesus was alive when they placed him in the tomb, and if someone got to him fairly quickly, he would have required modern medicine to revive him. There's no way that he would have survived and been able to go on to preach to hundreds of people. He would have been pretty messed up. There's no way that he could have survived that, especially after being in the tomb for 3 days. So the second thing is the hallucination theory. This theory says that those who saw Jesus after his death were actually hallucinating. This would be interesting to prove because more than 500 people say that they saw Jesus at one time. This would be more like mass hysteria. So when most people hallucinate, they don't see the same things, right? And they don't usually hallucinate in groups. But even if they were exposed to some type of substance that would make them all hallucinate at the same time, they wouldn't necessarily all see the same thing. So I find that this one doesn't really hold up. Then you have the vision theory. This is that Jesus arose spiritually and not physically from the dead. This was actually, I think this was one of the heresies that came up later. That it was his ghost or his spirit that they were seeing and not his body. The Gospels actually go out of their way to prove this theory wrong. Luke recounts in chapter 24 that Jesus says, "Why are you troubled, and why do questions rise in your heart? You see my hands and my feet, that it is I, myself. Handle me and see. For a spirit has not flesh and bone as you see that I have." And then a little later he says, "Have you anything to eat?" And we all know that ghosts don't eat. Actually, I think there are 2 specific areas where they specifically say that Jesus sat and ate with them. So then there's the theft theory. This is that his disciples stole his body and fabricated the whole resurrection. First of all, the Sanhedrin placed Roman guards outside of the tomb because they were worried that something like this was going to happen. Roman guards don't fall asleep at their post. The punishment for falling asleep at your post for a Roman guard was death. That's just not something that they would do. So there's no way that the apostles would have gotten past the Roman guards to get the body. But even if they did, even if they stole him from the tomb, how do you explain that 500 people saw him after his death? They would have really had to have found somebody, like the hidden twin of Jesus. How would they have found somebody to pass off to all of those people to make them believe that this really was the resurrected Jesus? That would have been very difficult to do. And the last one I want to talk about is the legend theory. This claims that the whole story of Jesus belongs to the realm of legend, not history. This theory can't account for the rise of the early church or the courage, enthusiasm, and ultimate martyrdom of the apostles. The idea that Jesus' life became exaggerated claims that as you get further and further from his death, the story gets bigger and bigger. But we know that the story was big at the time of his death, and that those who knew him the most died defending and proclaiming and insisting that it happened. You would have thought that if that really wasn't the case, those apostles at some point would have broken down and said, you know what? It didn't happen. I'm sorry, it didn't. But they didn't. All but one of them went to their death defending the truth that Jesus actually rose from the dead. So that leaves us believing the impossible, that Jesus actually did die, and he resurrected from the tomb 3 days later. So, why did Jesus have to die and resurrect? I'm going to wrap up with this. I don't really have, this is books and books and books of theory. I don't have time to fully explore, but I'm going to give a couple of reasons why Jesus had to die and resurrect. The first was to pay the debt that we couldn't pay for the original fall and for all of our sins. There are a bunch of variations on this theory of atonement, and again, I'm just going to try to sum it up briefly. Adam and Eve sinned against God. They chose their will over his, and the cost of that sin was death. Adam and Eve were finite beings. We're all finite beings, but they sinned against an infinite God. And essentially, by doing that, they committed an infinite sin. So how does a finite being recover from an infinite sin? The answer to that is that they can't. We don't have the capacity to do so. We're finite. And that's where Jesus comes in, who is himself infinite, who through the incarnation became fully man, but maintained his fully divine nature. Jesus thus had the power to reverse the sin of Adam and Eve by, instead of choosing his own will like they did, he chose God's will to the point of perfect obedience. Because he loved us, he became human and was perfectly obedient to God to the point of death. Being that he was infinite, his sacrifice too was also infinite. That's why we talk about the infinite sacrifice of Jesus. This was able to offset the infinite sin of Adam and Eve. And that's what we celebrate every weekend at Mass. We don't crucify him over and over again, like some people believe, but instead we partake in his infinite sacrifice, his sacrifice that is not limited to time or space. It's there to reach all of humanity, regardless of time. Of course, there's so much more of this that we could discuss, but that's a topic for another lecture. So the second reason is to prove to us that there's life beyond this world. This is huge right now. At that time, some Jews didn't believe in the resurrection. So what's the problem with not believing in an afterlife? Again, it's a common belief these days. It's materialism or secularism, the belief that there's nothing beyond this material world, that when you die, you're done, and that's it. So why is this a problem? It's a problem because if this is all we have, then there's really no reason to be good. There's no definitive right or wrong. There's no moral absolute. It doesn't matter what you do here because once you die, that's it. You only live once. You're just gone. But when he resurrected, not only did he prove that he was indeed the God-man, the Messiah and the Son of God, but he also showed us that there is a world beyond this world, and it's one that is so much more important than this world. So finally, he died and resurrected to show us how to live. What did he model for us? He modeled obedience. Obedience to the Father, even to the point of death. Self-sacrifice. And not just for those that we love, but for those that we don't like and for those who don't like us. This is so important. Rejecting our own will and instead obeying God is the opposite of what Adam and Eve did. Living for God and living for others, not ourselves. It's really the main thing that we as humans, as creatures of God, are called to do. When we make those sacrifices, even the small ones, we offer ourselves up to God. We give ourselves to God. When we offer up the sacrifice, that's one way for us to participate in Christ's passion. It's also one way for us to participate in Mass. When the priest says, "Pray, brethren, that my sacrifice and yours may be acceptable to God the Father Almighty." That's what we're talking about. It all boils down to really loving God above all things and truly loving your neighbor as yourself, doing things for others, not what the world wants you to do today, living for yourselves. St. Paul reminds us in his letter to the Philippians, "For to you has been granted for the sake of Christ, not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for him." So as we continue to the end of Holy Week and hopefully beyond, I challenge you to reject the selfishness that has infected this world today and instead try to live a life of sacrifice. Think of the cross. Live a life truly for God and for others, just like Jesus did for us. Try to actively and continually participate in Christ's passion. Let's bow for a moment in prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for sending us your Son, who willingly gave his life for us out of pure and unconditional love. Thank you also for gathering us here today to learn about his passion so that we too can do our best to participate in Christ's sufferings. You have given us everything. Help us give everything freely back to you. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. Thank you guys for coming. Y'all have a wonderful Easter.